Any useful application will need some way to send and receive data. In this lecture, we'll cover the basics of HTTP in Angular and see how to implement a GET request for our classifieds data. Okay, so we're going to make use of Angular's HTTP service now, but we're going to kind of fake things a bit. Because our data here isn't living on some remote server, we are going to keep it local and we are going to pretend that we're making HTTP requests to a remote location, but really it's going to be here locally on our machines. But that's okay, it's still going to give us the full effect of the HTTP service. And the first thing that we'll want to do is move all of the data we have here in our controller into its own file. So let's come over here and create a new folder in our project root. So we'll select new folder, and we'll say we want this to be called data. And then within the data folder, let's create a new file, and let's call this classifieds.json. We want this to be a JSON file because we are going to give it JSON data. So let's cut everything off of the classifieds array. We'll just take the whole array actually, and let's paste it into the JSON file here. And we can just format this a little bit better. I'll back all of this up. And there it is. All of our data is now in its own location. So let's save that. And to get a hold of the HTTP service, we do something much like we did for scope. We inject it here as a parameter. So we'll say we want HTTP as well. So perhaps you're familiar already with the HTTP verbs or methods that we've got available. We've got things like post and get, and we've got put and delete. And post is generally for sending data somewhere. Get is when you would want to retrieve data. Put is used for editing data, and delete for deleting data. And we can make HTTP requests of each of these types really easily with the $HTTP service. So if we want to get our data, what we'll have to do is make a GET request. And this is how we do it. We say $HTTP.get, and then as the first argument, we need to provide the URL to our data. Now, if this was a remote data set on a server somewhere, we'd want to access it by its URL, so we'd put the full URL to it. But because we're working locally here, we just need to point it to the data/classifieds.json file. Now, Angular's HTTP service returns what are called promises. We won't get too deep into promises, but basically they help us deal with the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. Basically what that means is that we could say have an instruction be given to do something that takes some amount of time, and instead of blocking the next line of code from executing until that first task completes, we can just go to that next line right away. Now this is really helpful in a lot of cases, but we need some way to deal with asynchronous requests. And so promises are a way for us to handle something asynchronous once it finishes. And once a promise resolves, we can tap into its then method, which says anything in here I want to happen once the promise is resolved. And we have to give then an anonymous function, and we're going to have this data parameter, which is going to be the data coming back from our GET request for our classifieds data. So then we can open up our function block here. And what we'll do is we'll actually move our scope.classifieds right here into this function. And so what we want to say is that when this resolves, scope.classifieds is equal to the data. And just to see actually how this works before doing that, why don't we log this out to the console? So I'm going to say console.log, and we're going to just log out that data that's returned. So let's save that and go over to the browser to check it out. We can open up developer tools by right-clicking and doing inspect elements, or you can do Option-Command-I on the Mac. So if we refresh the page, we should see our data come through, and here it is. All of our classified information over here disappeared because things aren't set up quite right yet. But you can see that we have an object returned. And on this object, we've got a data property that is an array of all of our data coming from our JSON file. So back over in our controller, what we can do is we can set our classifieds to be equal to data.data. And maybe just to avoid any kind of confusion, we can change this parameter out to be classifieds. And that just makes things a little bit easier to understand. We've got some classifieds data that's being returned, and we need to access the data property that's on it. So let's save that and refresh to see what we get. All right, all of our data is showing up just like it was before. But instead of that data coming from our controller directly now, we've actually put all of our data into its own file, and we're making an HTTP request to get it. Another thing that we can point out is when we make this HTTP request, we can see it happen in the console. So looking back over at the network tab, let's refresh again. And here we can see we are getting our classifieds.json file. We can even preview it to see that we're getting all of the data showing up just the same. So just to recap, our HTTP service has several methods on it. One of them is get, to make a get request for our data. At this point, the data is just in its own JSON file locally, so we don't have to put a full URL here, but we would if we had it living somewhere remotely. Since the get method returns a promise, we tap into the then method to handle it as it resolves. And as it resolves, we want to get a hold of the data that's returned, which is this classified parameter here. Once it resolves, we want to put that data on scope by accessing the data property that is returned from this object. So that's how we handle HTTP requests, and right now we're just making this HTTP request right here within the controller. In the next video, we're going to introduce the concept of services, which will allow us to make our code more reusable.